This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are delighted today to have the Reverend John McCullough with us. John is CEO of Churchill Services, cwsglobal.org. And full disclosure, it has been my honor and privilege to have been a board member at CWS. John, welcome.
Well, thank you, Marshall and Joel. It's good to be with you and to be with your listeners. As you said, I'm John McCullough, and I've had the privilege over the last 2 decades of being the president and CEO of Churchill Services, which is a very historic faith-based organization. It was founded in 1946 in response to post-war recovery. And at that time, it developed key elements of helping to address the needs of people who were seeking refuge. And so working on refugee resettlement and immigration, working on sustainable development, public advocacy for those who were the most vulnerable, the most impacted by the war itself, as well as disaster response. So these basic elements have been part and parcel of this organization for now. Well, we've just entered into our 75th year as an organization. Someone once said, well, what kind of an impact can the church have? And the reality is that through CWS alone, more than $2 billion worth of development aid has been dispersed around the world. More than 1 million people have been resettled all across the United States as a result of this work. We responded to the largest disasters which have unfolded around the world. So people can have a tremendous amount of impact as faith community, as well as in other types of organizations.
Well, speaking of disasters, with COVID, it just seems as though everything has come together into one of the largest global humanitarian crises we've seen, really in our lifetime, since World War II, when CWS started. CWS has always been a very grassroots organization, a lot of members and activism in the field. And I'm just wondering, as you look at COVID, what has been the impact of COVID on faith-based and humanitarian-based organizations like CWS?
Well, I'm glad that you noted, sort of the grassroots nature of the organization. So, it definitely is not a hierarchical kind of organization. It really is about people who are paying attention to the realities that are unfolding around them and seeking to understand how they can have an impact. And that's exactly how CWS was formulated. And that's been the fuel that has kept this engine going for 75 years. And so the coronavirus is really essentially the same thing. Where here we have this pandemic that has emerged. And, CWS as a global organization for us, was not only recognizing the advent of the pandemic in the United States, but for us, it was also recognizing it in Southeast Asia. I think that's where we first began to encounter it because we have significant presence in a wide variety of countries there, but then also in Eastern Europe. We have presence there. In fact, just before the New York City area hospitals focused in on the pandemic. I had just traveled in Eastern Europe, and I was in Italy, and in fact, I left Milan 2 days before the country shut down. Sort of the grassroots nature of pandemics, of response to pandemic is something that is very much inherent in the life of or the DNA of a CWS. And so we have found that people have very much rallied around this. They've have first sought to try to understand, well, what is this thing? And obviously there's an enormous fear factor, because it's like this enemy that none of us can identify. Where is it? How do you sort of put your hands on it? How do you determine where you can be or where you can't be? But certainly our experience has been that people have rallied around it. They said, well, we can have a positive impact, and we can talk about some of the ways in which they've tried to do that.
Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I wrote an article for Quillette with a friend from South Africa, and he says that the impact in developing countries has been even more severe than it is, partially because the medical systems aren't there, governments are not necessarily even remotely effective. How do you operate in a crisis like this in countries where the governmental structures are fairly dysfunctional?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in one sense, in a country that is less developed, people are less dependent, or they have they don't have expectations, that the government itself is going to resolve the crisis. They already sort of operate out of a sense of awareness, that they have to take charge of their own personal lives. And so some of the simple things, like, in this country, we talked a lot about, you have to maintain your social distance, you have to wash your hands, you have to, all these different things that we talked about. Well, in a lot of the developing countries, agencies like CWS already have a long history of working with local communities around health and sanitation, and so there's a consciousness, already about, making sure that you attend to personal hygiene on an ongoing basis, and really understanding that within your family unit or your community unit, you need to be able to rely upon each other, that there's a sense of trust and confidence and networking that you have to build in order for that community or that family to be able to not only succeed, but most importantly, to survive. So they're not looking for, some kind of a federal system to come in, and solve the issue for them. They understand it in a more localized way. And I think there's a huge difference between that and from what happened in the US, in which we're still in the US talking about the failure of the federal government to be able to provide the resources and the services that are needed and for us to get through this pandemic.
Are we finding within CWS that people are donating more? Are they kind of diverted with their donations to other things in the middle of this?
Well, that's also kind of interesting, because one of the things that is sort of unique about CWS is that it, in many ways, it is it sort of introduced the idea of community-based fundraising to the United States, we have this initiative which we call the Crop Hunger Walks, and going back into the mid to late 1960s, we introduced this opportunity for people to walk and to be sponsored by their family members and their friends and whatever, as a way of raising money to address issues of hunger and poverty around the world. And so it's always been predicated on a personal demonstration of your commitment to a situation that you're concerned about. So when the pandemic hit, and the guidance was given to people to stay in the safety of their own homes, obviously that created for us as CWS and other agencies that have since followed the example of these community-based fundraising activities, to have to rethink, well, what do we do? Because we can't tell people to gather, outside of or on the grounds of Duke University and let's have a rally and then we're all walk together and demonstrate how much we really care about hunger in North Carolina and around the world, kind of thing. So the challenge became one of asking people, would you be willing to sort of look at a different way of doing that? And where the emphasis really turned towards a more virtual reality, we found that our donors easily gravitated to that. And so they found ways and means of talking to those same family members and friends and say, hey, I still have this commitment, maybe I'll go out and walk just by myself, but you tune in and sort of watch me, or, just recognize, or maybe I'm not going to go out and walk, but I'm still going to dedicate, these minutes or these hours during a particular day. And if you continue to support me, that would be great. And we found that people actually did support it.
So they already had a vehicle to go online and with their donations anyway, and
Right.
monitor the progress of the different walks. And so this is just it hadn't really changed that at all.
I think it's sort of interesting. I think a lot of baby boomers who had been a bit hesitant about the technology and how do you really use it, found that now all of a sudden they had all this time on their hands at home, and began to experiment with it and discovered it's not so bad after all, and it can be helpful.
they let their fingers do their walking to their wallets.
Exactly.
That's great.
So you were able to basically not take a hit, because in the research we've done,
Mhm.
Jewish federations, many churches, I've talked to imams at the mosques, because they depend a great deal on physical proximity to help create the contributions. That has not hurt you.
Yeah, that's, in terms of the crop hunger walks, I would say that to a large extent, we pretty much have held our own. And we recognize that that is not the norm. That is really sort of an unusual set of circumstance, but it also speaks to the level of loyalty that people may have for this cause and working with this organization. But then, Joel, if we look at it in the context of people in the pews, that becomes a different scenario. So, it's one thing for someone to say, I'm going to do this walk and will you support me? It's another thing where people are accustomed to being gathered together, in the pews of their house of worship. And that becomes sort of the foundation for how, they give expression to their philanthropy. And so the fact that, Churchill Services is an organization that's related to 37 different religious organizations around primarily in the US, but also beyond the US. And so to the extent that people didn't have the opportunity to be sitting in the pews, ultimately had a residual impact on us. Just as it would have an impact on the local pastor. I would talk to the pastor of the church where I attend, and we're looking together at the budget, and we're acknowledging that, if we're not making, strong and repeated asks, reminders to the members, that their gifts are important, then we're not going to be top of mind, because their mindset is, I go to the place of worship, I participate in worship. There is that moment in which there is an expectation that I'm going to put something into the offering plate. And so when you sort of take that out of the mix, then it isn't something that people think about, on a daily basis. They've moved on. Even if they're tuning in on, Sunday, they're looking at the worship service online. They're still not necessarily saying, okay, at this moment, I need to, send an online donation, or I need to write out my check and put it in the mail or whatever, so, and if people don't do that in the local church or house of worship, then an organization like Churchill Service also loses out on the benefit, because that is that local church as a community that decides a portion of what they're receiving is what they're contributing to an organization like Churchill Services, and we lose that pot.
I'd like to actually talk a little bit more about the cause itself and kind of reflect on where we are in history. Over the last 4 years with the Trump administration, we've seen a focus, especially when it comes to immigration policy and things like that, of really focusing on America first, kind of an inward-looking view. I know that CWS has been involved in relocating immigrants once they get vetted by, the various security people of coming into the U.S., but that dropped a lot under the Trump administration. What are you anticipating for the changeover to the Biden administration? How do you think things will change?
Well, yeah, I mean, in fact, there's been a significant decrease in the number of people who are either eligible or are approved for resettlement in the United States. I mean, at the time that Mr. Obama was his last year of his administration, he projected that he was going to allow about 110,000 people to be resettled, and to where we are today, where the Trump administration is really looking at, maybe between 5,000 and 10,000 if we're lucky. So it's a tremendous drop in terms of the numbers of people that are eligible for resettlement in the U.S. Mr. Biden has indicated that he intends to significantly increase the numbers. In fact, to expand beyond the 110,000 presidential determination that Mr. Obama spoke about, and so that's very impressive. But here's the reality. The reality is that the United States, like many other countries, if not in fact most other countries around the world, is deeply polarized. I mean, that's so I mean the politics are very, very clear in this country. That there certainly are significant numbers of people who believe that it's important to provide opportunities for people, especially in the midst of civil chaos or economic crises or even climate change, to be able to have the option to leave where they are and to get to a place where they can feel safe. And so that's important to them. But then there are others who feel, that there should be limitations in terms of the numbers of people that are allowed to come in. And those feelings are very strong feelings. So I think Mr. Biden is going to have a challenge on his hand. I mean, I certainly think that the numbers in the case of the U.S. resettlement activity is going to increase, but I think it's going to be very gradual. I can't foresee that there would be so dramatic of an increase within the first or even the second year of his administration, because you've got to work through the polarities. In almost any social setting, I mean, even sitting in a house of worship, I mean, you just know, that, there are people who feel one way politically, and there are people who feel the other way politically. And I've been in this work long enough to be able to recall times in which I could organize, delegations of religious leaders to take them to Washington or to other places of political leadership around the world and engage those leaders around matters of public policy. And those religious leaders would be able to speak with confidence that they represented the embodiment of their denomination or their church body. And that changed, and so you don't see a lot of religious leaders going as delegations to the White House or other places any longer, because the reality is that they don't have that luxury. They know that as soon as they offer a perspective, that there will be a significant backlash from people who are part of that denomination or church life who simply do not share those views.
One question I would have, John, is it would seem to me that COVID will make resettlement more difficult, given that developing countries, from everything I'm seeing, are not as likely to vaccinate as many of their people. Mm-hmm. Will COVID be a problem, even if President Biden decides that he wants to increase refugees? Won't people make the argument, well, we let more refugees in, they may spread the disease. I mean, historically, disease has been something that people get very worried about importing.
Sure, sure. No, I mean, I think that's definitely going to be a factor. We don't know how long it's going to take for us to get to a place globally where we have the level of confidence that there's a standard of care that's fairly consistent from one country to the next. I think it's going to take a long time for that to happen. We can already see, that just within this country alone, I mean, we're the level of performance in terms of getting the vaccinations out to people is going to be a very long, arduous process. But I think there's another dimension to this, and it is that I think globally, I mean, in one sense, we can sort of point to the policies of the Trump administration, but we would be short-sighted if we sort of just stopped at that place. I think the reality is that there are many, many governments around the world that are no longer willing to sort of be the pass-through, and so where we had for many, many years gone through a period of time in which if a person sought to flee from their country to another country of safety, they would go to a country of first resort. That's where they would make their case. That's where they would be screened, and that's where their eligibility for resettlement to another country, to a third country, would be determined. Now, most people who flee their country, that when they get to that first country of resort, that is their only option. There is no other option for them other than to return home. And so now the host governments are going to have to reconcile, well, what does it mean that we have these people in our midst? And for the most part, they would choose to put them into camps. They would try to restrict their movements, and so, but we know that that's not a long-term solution for anybody, right? I mean, eventually you have to be able to live your life. You can't live for 50, 60, 70 years inside a refugee camp. People need to be able to find a place to go home. They need to be able to educate their children. They need to be able to become self-sufficient and so forth and so on. So the challenge is going to be more of how does a host government figure out the ways and means of enabling those folks who have come across their border, and they're porous borders, just like the southwest border of the US is really a porous border. How do you find the ways and means of integrating those people into your country? Because really that's where they're going to be,
Well, and John, just so our listeners understand, we're not talking about just a couple of people here or there.
That's correct.
What is the size of this community that's living in refugee camps worldwide?
Right. So, I mean, you're talking about, tens of thousands of people, that are in these camps. I mean, I've had experiences where some camps I've gone in and, at first appearance, you'd say, wow, I mean, it's like 1 million people here, so massive numbers of people, who flee from one situation because they hear that, okay, this is the place where you can go, in order to get out of harm's way. That's where they go, and they end up being restricted into those locations. And so, these camps can be massive in terms of the numbers of people that are being held there, but without the resources that are necessary. I mean, they don't have adequate supplies of water. They don't have the ability to produce a lot of food to sustain themselves. They don't have health systems. They don't have, these are locations that are not desirable under any set of circumstances.
Right. And collectively, the last data that I saw showed that there were about 67 million people living in these circumstances around the world. Does that sound accurate?
Oh yeah, that's very accurate. And the fact of the matter is that, we're looking at sort of the reality of not only people who are in these circumstances because of civil conflict and because of economic crisis, but increasingly we're looking at the numbers of people that are having to choose relocation because of climate change. And with that, within that theater alone, we're looking at the potential of about another 100 million people. So it's a very, very significant number of people that are facing the prospects of displacement, and obviously no one country, you can't even have the discussion, about the U.S. being a place where we say, the portals are open and everybody come here. Nobody's interested in having 100 million people come to the United States. I mean, that's not even a conversation. So you have to look at what is a realistic number, but that number is always minuscule. I mean, less than 1%, of people who are in refugee camps end up being resettled to a third country. So I think the challenge for us as a global community is to devise new strategies and policies and look at how do we amass the kind of resources that enable those countries of first resort to develop the capacity to care for people within their setting and to effectively integrate them into their societies, because that's where those people are going to be.
Right. What I'd like to wrap up with is kind of continuing on this notion to be able to tackle a problem of moral dimension, like the problems we just been talking about with displaced people, requires people thinking outside of themselves, outside of their personal needs. And we've devolved, it seems, and this is my own opinion on it, but it seems like we've devolved into this kind of collective narcissism that I want to get my own, right? I don't really care about anybody else. This is at least in the United States. What do we have a hope of solving that problem? And is our religious institutions or faith-based institutions like CWS a ticket to make that happen?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, what religious community does is it calls people into connection with one another. I mean, religion is not predicated really on the self. It's always about a person in relationship to others, and so that's sort of an inherent strength, that religious communities bring, especially, in the context of a country like the United States, where our freedom, religious freedom has been such an important value. So, and then when you have organizations, and a lot of your humanitarian organizations like CWS really sort of grow out of the life of faith communities. So I think that's also true. Maybe it might be a little bit of an overstatement, but I don't think so. That a lot of your institutions of higher education and learning also have grown out of the context of faith community. They may not be, officially related today, but if you sort of, trace back their history, you'll find, that it was through the intentional activities of faith community that valued learning, and created the framework for that opportunity to be afforded to people who most needed it. So I think that an organization like CWS is inherently committed to always look for the ways and means for us to think through very complicated problems and to try to find solutions that work for the good of the whole and not just for some. And so, I see an organization, a humanitarian organization, working with governments to help them think through, okay, what's the complex problem that we're facing? Sort of acknowledging, okay, these are the ways and means in which you may have tried to tackle these problems in the past, but now given sort of the changed reality, what are some of the other kinds of things that we could potentially do, that would really sort of help to move us forward, and how could we potentially pool our resources in ways that are different and yet more effective than we have done in the past. So, I would find myself at times saying, as a case in point, if a country like the United States decided that it didn't want to be open, for people to be resettled here, it doesn't necessarily mean that government is opposed to the idea of people having a safe place to call home. So how do you then have a different conversation with that government where you're not trying to force them to do something that they don't want to do, but you're looking to them to say, okay, you have all these people that have landed in Jordan. And Jordan, the government of Jordan is being overrun because they don't have the financial resources to care for all these people who have now come have crossed, into their
This is mostly Syria, right? Coming from Syria.
Yeah, exactly. So is there a way that the United States government, as a case in point, could provide additional resource to the government of Jordan that would help them to effectively resettle people within their national boundaries, so that they would have the opportunity to become effective citizens within that country and have the kind of quality of life that really we would hope everybody would have. I think there are opportunities to sort of, and I think organizations like CWS can help lead the way for governments to rethink what it means to care for the most vulnerable that are within their area of jurisdiction.
I just like to end up on this, in the work that I've been doing and looking at history, religious organizations have played a unique role. Christianity in particular grew in part because it offered solace and also aid to people during the pestilence of the second, third, fourth centuries
Sure.
AD.
Right.
And yet at the same time, modernity seems to be working against the idea of church and the idea of religion. Do you think we're going to come out of COVID with a renewed sort of spirit of, Christian and other religious charity and activism, or is the sort of, what Marshall talked about, the sort of narcissism, is that going to reduce it? So, I mean, the long-term prognosis for religious organizations after COVID, short-term seems to be difficult. Do you see any hope in the long term that this will be sort of something that will renew that commitment as it did in the earlier days of the church?
Yeah, I actually do. I think that religion. I think that what's going to happen is that it's going to be reinvented. Yeah. I mean, I sort of look at the traditional approaches to religion, and I'm very much sort of a very traditionalist. I mean, I grew up in that kind of a family in which we knew what we were supposed to do, and we always do it. And I'm still, I mean, even though my local church is not having services in person, I still write out my check every week, and I find a way to get down to the church and put it in the mailbox. I mean, I'm very traditional in that sense, but I also recognize that there's a new level of, or a new type of spirituality, that is not beholden, to the formal church, as we have really sort of known it over the last, certainly the last century, I would say, so I think there's going to be a reinvention, and so I unfortunately, I think a lot of the buildings that exist are no longer going to be utilized in ways that they were in the past, and I think people are going to discover or discern new ways of being gathered together as community. I think the values of what faith represents, I think will hold, but I think that they'll reinvent how it gets done, what it means for people to come together, how they express their spirituality, how they express their sense of care for the other, their sense of charity and concern for others. I think all of that is going to change. So I'm not afraid of it. I'm actually excited about what that might look like, and I know, I mean, an organization like CWS has been part of what we call sort of the ecumenical movement, and for quite some time, I've been saying, I think we're in a new ecumenical moment, so, sort of the model of how churches would collaborate together in the past is not necessarily how it needs to be done into the future, and people are not wired that way, and I think it's quite okay. I mean, if you really do believe that there is a power greater at work in the world than ourselves, then you have to also allow for the possibility that that power foresees that there's another way of doing things that could be much more to the advantage of our growth and development as human beings. So I'm excited about what the future holds. I think spirituality will continue to expand. It'll be very, very different. None of the studies that I've seen give any indication that people will be any less spiritual or religious than they have in the past. I just think how it is expressed will be different. And I think it'll be okay.
Well, John,
that was great.
Let's hope this comes to pass.
Okay.
Thank you so much for spending time with us, John McCullough from CWS. For those of you interested in learning more about CWS, the website is cwsglobal.org. And thank you again, John, and we wish you the best.
All right. Peace of the Lord be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.